I think there's actually a fair bit of mischief about that story because it was used as a kind of totemic example of woke left-wing BBC doing things the BBC shouldn't be doing, having a pop at the government, and goodness sake. And I never really thought anybody seriously considered that the BBC shouldn't be doing satire, and satire by definition will always, have I got news for you, has been running for 20 odd years. And the last time I looked, that's precisely the DNA of that programme, is to poke fun, lampoon, cartoon and parody the government and topical news figures. So nobody's got a problem with that, surely, have they? But it was accused of left-wing bias, of course, and we're told it won't return for another series. The broadcaster said it was very proud of the programme, but will be axing it in order to make room for new comedy shows. Well, they should have, actually, what that line should have said, we're axing it in order to make room for a comedy show. The show, a satirical take on the week's news, featured Nish Kumar and Rachel Parris, first aired in 2017. Dominic Lawson, of course, is a columnist at the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail. Dominic, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, Ian.
Were you a huge must-see-it, had it in the diary every week MASH report viewer?
No, I think what happened was I occasionally accidentally found myself watching it because it was before Newsnight, or certainly the highlight version, and I was sort of slack-jawed in astonishment at just how bad it was. And I don't mean whether it's left-wing or not, but just how poor, I mean, as a comedy show it was, just the quality of the so-called humour.
Sure.
And I believe it had very, well, increasingly poor ratings. And as you rightly said in your introduction, really to call it comedy was an insult to the term.
When you consider, I mentioned that was the week that was, not my era, I'm sure not your era either, Dominic, but our parents' era when they would watch David Frost and co, really satirising the news. And then since then, we've had a variety. Spitting Image, of course, was a famous satirical programme. And there have been others, and I mentioned Have I Got News for You and the like. So nobody's got a problem with satire, and nobody's got a problem with having a pop at our parliamentarians.
No, and I think when you mentioned that was the week that was, which, yes, my parents loved, and I used to sort of piggyback off it. They would they had records, LPs it was in those days.
Yeah.
And you had Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, who were, there's no other term for it, geniuses.
Correct.
I mean, real geniuses, whatever your politics. My father was a conservative, but he found it absolutely hilarious.
Yeah.
And, quality will always out. I think it's very sad, Ian, actually, because this has been modelled on the Americans who have, the late show, which was Jon Stewart and is now Stephen Colbert. They are both of the left. They are both absolutely brilliant.
Completely.
And it's really a sad comment on the quality of, if Nish Kumar is the best the BBC can come up with in terms of topical comedy. It's not just a sad comment on the BBC, it's a sad comment on the country.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned that because we had a conversation, Charlotte, our producer, and myself before the programme. We were talking about exactly that, the American late night shows, the Daily Show as well, which interestingly had been up till recently presented by a Brit as well, a guy called John Oliver. And, these kind of programmes are side-splittingly hilarious, and they often do, in their heart, are from the left. But we watch them, and we can see the hard work that's gone in,
or
and they work.
Saturday Night Live.
Indeed, all of those.
Tina Fey.
Correct. All of those kind of programs. For some reason, I don't know why. I mean, the MASH report. I mean, it saddens me in a way, Dominic, because actually, I should declare an interest. One of my friends was one of the panellists on it, and I thought, oh my goodness, how can I say bad things about a program when I'm sure you've come across this in your career when you have to write stuff about people that you quite like. But there's the problem. It just wasn't funny. That was the trouble with the MASH report.
Yes, I mean, for example, I did actually take a note, and I'm going to read it for your listeners. This was one of his lines on the Conservatives. It goes like this. After the crash of 2008, the economy was in trouble, and George Osborne combined that by cutting state spending to the bone and lowering taxes for high earners and for corporations, passing the burden for paying off the recession to the poorest people. How do you interpret that as anything other than political choice masquerading as economic necessity? Now, boom, it's the way he tells them.
Yeah.
I mean, the fact is, if that was a Labour Party political broadcast, you'd say, well, fine.
Fair enough.
Yes. Fine. But the idea that people can make these speeches, by the way, there is the requirement of what you might call bias-free broadcasting on the BBC, and not just the BBC. And I noticed that when Nish Kumar, in one of his sadly repeated programs, he actually attacked this whole concept of bias, and he basically, what he said, and I'm not making this up, he said, Tommy Robinson is interviewed by the BBC all the time. Now, he must know that was not true. He has never been interviewed by the BBC, or if so, only once or possibly twice. I don't know of any.
Yeah.
So what he was saying is basically the BBC is always having fascists on air, and I'm here to counter the fascism which the BBC is broadcasting. Only it never did.
No, it never did.
Yeah. It never did.
Yeah.
So he was really. It was really based on a kind of deliberately false notion of what balance was. But as you say, and I totally agree, people can be as left-wing as they like. I mean, Jeremy Hardy, for example, who was on BBC Radio a lot, and I once did a comedy show with it. I was one of the Stooges, basically.
Did you do the news quiz with him?
Yes, I did. And I got on very well with him. He sadly died now.
He did.
He was a member of the International Socialist Group. I mean, he was very, very far left. But Jeremy Hardy was a very subtle and amusing person. And even if you didn't agree, and I certainly didn't with where he came from, he was very, very funny. And he was very popular and much loved. And so that's the issue, really. It's basically the inadequacy, not just whether it's left wing or not.
I think you've probably picked the better example. I wish I'd thought of it, Dominic. I think Jeremy Hardy was absolutely the completely correct example in this, because, as you say, I mean, this guy's he was more left wing than an Albanian keep left sign, for goodness sake. And that was his thing. That was what he did. But his writing, his delivery, he was gifted, he was funny, but he was likable. All of those things. Nobody blinked and thought this was the BBC doing left wing bias.
He was clever and original. And actually, I think it's really summed up. I don't know whether you saw, but because I knew I was going to be speaking to you, I went online onto Twitter and looked up Nish Kumar, and on his thing, he says people are asking for my comment, and he then said, here it is, and it was a picture of him pointing to a sign from one of his programs saying, Boris Johnson is a liar and a racist. Now, you think, is that the best a comedian can do? I mean, when you've been fired, it is actually the opportunity to be very funny.
That's right.
And that's what he does.
Yeah, well, he kind of explained his own firing in a way in that tweet, I suppose, to us.
Yes, but I mean, it just shows what a sort of crude and unfunny person he is. Yeah. But that is, he could have had a bit of fun then, if he wanted to.
Of course he could.
Yeah.
On the wider point, Dominic, just a final point on the BBC. I mean, I notice people like Alistair Campbell call it the Brexit Broadcasting Company. They believe it's incredibly pro-Brexit and did all it could to advance the cause of Brexit. And then, of course, if you are a hardened Brexit supporter, Nigel Farage or somebody might say the BBC did all it could to be a spokes or a mouthpiece for Remain. They've always been in that position, haven't they? They can't really win in the overarching discussion about bias. I mean, where do you see them generally, the Beeb?
Well, I think during the Brexit campaign, actually, they were very scrupulous. And I think they tried very hard to have complete balance. And, of course, this was a huge affront to people like Alistair Campbell, because the BBC had in the past, as I think the new Director General has indicated, not really even thought to understand why people should want to leave the European Union. It was regarded as a form of insanity by almost everyone in New Broadcasting House. and then, of course, after the campaign, so they did very well. They then again, basically, if you looked at during the whole should we have another referendum business, you generally saw that on panels you would, almost as a rule, have two anti-Brexiters against one Brexiter. And I myself went on 2 or 3 programs, I think it was Newsnight, and on both times I found myself in the minority when the fact is the country was split pretty much 50-50. Sure. And so, but for the BBC, the idea, and still I think, I don't know anyone there within that organisation who doesn't actually think it's a form of insanity. And and I think that what Tim David, the new DG, understood was that in this respect they had lost touch with at least half of their own audience.
Yeah, I sense you're absolutely spot on there. Dominic, thank you. Lovely to have you on. Dominic Lawson, much respected journalist, of course, columnist with the Sunday Times and the Daily Mail with his take on the MASH report. The headline there, and I think we all knew this, it just wasn't particularly funny. And that's such a shame because I know it had funny people around it. Jeff Norcott would often appear on there. I keep mentioning Steve Van Allen, not just because he's a mate, but Steve is just generally good, whether he's on the radio or on the telly. Nish Kumar isn't a funny man, I'm afraid. He's just not got funny bones. And if you consider what, again, it goes back to that point about the Americans, whether it's the Daily Show, the Late Show, the Late Late Show, and there are many at Saturday Night Live, as Dominic just referenced there. I mean, this stuff is finely polished, think of a jeweler with their most treasured diamond, and those formats are that finely polished. Nothing gets through unless it's met all those very difficult standards and benchmarks of being tip-top and ready to go and funny. And they do it with aplomb. They do it just with such class on those formats. Stephen Colbert, every time somebody leaves one of those late shows. I mean, you had Craig Ferguson, a Brit, a Scot. I think he's a naturalised American now. John Oliver doing the Daily Show for all of those years. And, of course, Matey McDougall. What's he called? James Corden doing... Matey McDougall, as he's known to his friends. James Corden as well. There's a kind of a Brit thing going on there, disproportionately so. But the huge writing teams they have behind those shows and the way they are produced and the way they are put together. There's a book called The Late Shift, which is really worth reading. It's about Letterman and Leno and the kind of the battle of the ratings and the way the networks work. It's absolutely fascinating. I mean, the Howard Stern stuff is always interesting in radio, but in TV terms, that stuff is just golden to read about. And they just do it. And we come up with the MASH report, which was just, I mean, who thought Nish Kumar was the bloke? Now, he'd be good. He's right up there with that lot, isn't he? No, I mean, you might put him on as a warm-up at Jongleurs if it was still going, but other than that, on my telly, not really there yet. 20 years' time, possibly, I don't know.